less generally known that Salem, Massachusetts, had a role in a less significant murder and trial involving Captain Joseph White, despite the fact that it is most well known for being the scene of the witch trials that took place between 1692 and 1693. These trials took place in Salem. A significant number of amendments were made to the laws of Massachusetts as a direct consequence of this event, which was not just a historic occurrence in the history of the town. The town of Salem, Massachusetts, was considered to be one of the most important ports in the United States at the time of Captain White's murder in April of 2018. This site was also the scene of the criminal act that took place. A substantial amount of money had been lavished onto merchants in Salem as a consequence of the thriving marine business that was going place in the town where they were located. Captain Joseph White was an individual who successfully embodied this description. It is said in the diary of Reverend William Bentley that he had earned a considerable amount of wealth as a result of his participation in the slave trade. Through his involvement in marine business, he had amassed a sizable wealth. Captain White had reached the age of 82 and had resigned from this profitable position when he passed away. He had been working for this company for many years. Stephen White, who was his adopted son, was the one who was in charge of making sure that the family's wealth was protected. Despite the fact that her uncle did not approve of the marriage, Mary White Beckford, who was Captain White's favorite niece, wed Joseph Jenkins Knapp, Jr. on November 6, 1827. This was despite the fact that her uncle was against the union. According to Captain White, he was of the belief that Joseph Knapp, Jr. was someone who attempted to find a fortune. Mary was disinherited by Captain White after she married him, regardless of the circumstances surrounding their marriage. The act of making this decision served as the impetus for all that was to follow. Joseph Knapp finally came to the conclusion that if he were to convince Captain White to die away without leaving a living will, then his wife would be entitled to collect 50% of Captain White's income. This was the belief that Joseph Knapp held. In contrast, if he did nothing to alter the circumstances, Captain White's demands would be imposed on his wife. She would be subject to Captain White's demands. One of the reasons why Joseph Knapp made the decision to take matters into his own hands was because of the offense that they had given him by marrying. In order to appreciate the rationale that Joseph uses to support his opinion that this is true, it is necessary to have a knowledge of estate law. As of the year 1830, Captain White had 5 potential heirs, all of whom were children of his brothers. All of these individuals were related to Captain White. His sister, Mary Knapp, only had 1 child, but his brother Henry had 4 children during the course of their lives. The only kid that Mary had was with Joseph Knapp's wife. Both per stirps, which literally means by branch, and per capita, which means by the head, were the 2 ways that it was possible to receive the inheritance of a deceased relative in the case that there was no living will for the deceased person. Both of these terms are derived from the Latin phrase per stirpes. The word per capita refers to the distribution of the inheritance among all people who are equally linked to the dead, with each person getting an equal portion regardless of the number of consecutive lines of descent and regardless of how many generations have passed since the deceased. As a result of this, if Captain White's wealth were to be distributed in accordance with the criteria of each person, each niece and nephew would get an equal 1/5 portion of the whole income. In a different sense, the term per stirps refers to the equitable distribution of the estate among the several branches of the family. It is possible that the children of Captain White's siblings would be eligible to inherit the portion of his property that would have been anticipated to be handed down to them in the event that Captain White's wealth was divided according to stirps. The offspring of Mary White would get 50% of the estate, while the children of Henry would receive the remaining 50% of the property. If Mary had just one child who was still living, and that child was Joseph's wife, then 50% of the inheritance would be handed to Joseph. Mary had only one child who was still alive. Per stirps was the procedure that was used in Massachusetts for the purpose of resolving issues that were related to estates. At first glance, it would seem that Joseph was aware of this. When Joseph needed aid in plotting the murder, he turned to his brother Francis for assistance. Joseph did this with the goal of carrying out the murder. A member of yet another renowned and wealthy Salem family, Richard Crowninshield, had been a presence in Essex County that involved violent crimes over the course of many years. He was a member of the Crowninshield family. Richard agreed to carry out the murder when the Knapp brothers approached him with their plan. Richard offered his agreement to carry out the murder. By walking into Captain White's bedroom a few days before the murder, Joseph Knapp, Jr., was able to find a written will that had been left behind by Captain White. While he was under the belief that this was the most current version of the will and the only copy that was still in existence, he seized it and then proceeded to unlatch a window on the ground floor of the White House. After he had been successful in destroying the will, the next step was to take Captain White's life away from him. He went one step farther than that. Richard Crowninshield and the Knapp brothers had a meeting outside of the White House on the evening of April 6, 1830. This meeting took place outside of the White House. While the Knapp brothers stayed outside in their position as lookouts, Richard Crowninshield entered the mansion via the window that was not properly secured, as depicted in the picture that came before this one, and committed the murder. Having struck Captain White over the head with a hammer that was encased in lead, which can be seen here, he then proceeded to repeatedly stab him in the heart with a long dirk that he had taken with him. In order to avoid being detected, he was able to get out of the mansion with the assistance of the Knapp brothers. The crux of the issue is that the will that Joseph Knapp had stolen was not the most current form of the will. Instead, it was an older version. Even in the event that it had been, as was said before, his assumption about the rules of estate law that were now in operation was incorrect. The assassination of Captain White had taken place, and Joseph Knapp had not even been successful in accomplishing the goal he had been striving toward. In light of this, it seems certain that Joseph Knapp will ultimately inherit even more substantial problems, even if this does not happen right away. He could not possibly escape being apprehended by the authorities in any manner. The succeeding events involve a search for the murderer or killers, which is chronicled in great detail, as well as the recording of the trials and the executions that took place after the murders and trials. Everyone who is interested may go through the newspapers that were published in Salem in the year 1830 and explore the occurrence of this incident and the effects of it step by step. This is something that is possible for everyone who is interested. When it comes to some historical events, there are those that do not have a significant quantity of information from their original sources. The act of reading these articles has the additional benefit of serving as a case study on the nature of the interaction that exists between the general public and the institutions that are associated with the media. Instantaneously, Stephen White proposed a reward of $1,000, and shortly the Salem selectmen proposed a reward of $500. They were both made accessible to the public. From that point on April 13, 1830, Stephen White granted his consent for the particulars of the autopsy to be published in the Salem Gazette newspaper. One may find a huge number of works that deal with moral wrath and astonishment, in addition to the factual information that is being shared. The nature of the contact between the media and the public, which is one that is both provocative and combustible, becomes clear at this point. This relationship is characterized by their nature. In contrast to the plethora of conversation over the event, there is a dearth of presentation of the facts that are reported in the news. The identity of the person who had committed the murder remained a mystery for a considerable amount of time. It was decided to form a committee of vigilance in order to address the widespread fear and dread that was prevalent across the community. The establishment of this group, which was formed of 27 members and acted as a neighborhood watch organization, took place. Considering that the committee had been granted authorization to search residences, it was not necessary for them to get a warrant in order to do so. On the other hand, it would seem that the people of Salem were unconcerned about the possibly catastrophic outcomes that may result from their decision.